actually turn Africa into a heaven in the next 5 years. You need to think big, then you grow big. You think small, you never grow.
Picture this, a single infrastructure project that could fundamentally alter the trajectory of African trade, challenge centuries of colonial economic structures, and demonstrate to the world that Africa's wealthiest entrepreneur isn't just building ports, he's constructing pathways to genuine economic sovereignty. While Western media focuses on surface-level narratives about African business ventures, something far more profound is unfolding along Nigeria's southwestern coastline in Ogun State. Aliko Dangote, Africa's richest man and arguably our continent's most strategic industrial visionary, has submitted a construction proposal for what could become Nigeria's largest and deepest seaport. But this isn't merely another business expansion. This represents a masterclass in economic self-determination that echoes the aspirations of independence leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, who understood that true freedom requires control over the means of production and distribution. The proposed port in the Olakola Free Trade Zone represents more than concrete and steel. It embodies the kind of indigenous African capital formation that our ancestors envisioned when they fought for independence. This is African wealth, African vision, and African strategic thinking converging to create infrastructure that serves African interests first, a radical departure from the extractive economic models imposed during the colonial era and perpetuated through neocolonial arrangements. When we examine Dangote's latest move, we're witnessing the emergence of what I call sovereign capitalism, economic development that prioritizes African agency and self-sufficiency over dependence on external validation or Western financial institutions. This port project, positioned strategically to serve Dangote's fertilizer and petrochemical plants in Lagos, represents the kind of integrated industrial planning that transforms raw materials into finished products on African soil, creating value chains that benefit African workers and consumers rather than enriching distant shareholders. To understand the revolutionary significance of Dangote's port proposal, we must first examine the historical context of African maritime infrastructure and its relationship to economic sovereignty. Throughout the colonial period, European powers systematically designed African ports to serve one primary function: the efficient extraction of raw materials to feed European industries. From the slave castles of Cape Coast to the mineral ports of southern Africa, maritime infrastructure was weaponized against African interests. The great Pan-Africanist Marcus Garvey understood this fundamental truth when he established the Black Star Line in 1919, recognizing that control over maritime transportation was essential for African economic independence. Though his shipping venture faced sabotage and financial difficulties, Garvey's vision anticipated the kind of indigenous African maritime capacity that leaders like Dangote are now actualizing. In the post-independence era, African nations inherited port systems designed for extraction rather than value addition. Lagos's Apapa and Tin Can Island ports, while crucial for Nigeria's economy, were structured around the colonial model of exporting raw materials and importing manufactured goods. This infrastructure reflected what the brilliant economist Walter Rodney identified as the systematic underdevelopment of Africa, where our continent's wealth was consistently channeled outward, rather than reinvested in local industrial capacity. The failure of many African governments to develop sophisticated maritime infrastructure created a dependency cycle that neocolonial powers exploited ruthlessly. International shipping companies, predominantly Western-owned, maintained control over African trade routes, while African nations paid premium prices for transportation services that should have been domestically controlled. This maritime dependency became a cornerstone of what Nkrumah prophetically called neocolonialism, the practice of using economic control to achieve what direct political control once accomplished. However, the emergence of African industrialists like Dangote represents a fundamental shift in this dynamic. Unlike the comprador bourgeoisie that historically facilitated Western extraction, Dangote's approach demonstrates what happens when indigenous African capital is deployed strategically to build integrated industrial ecosystems. His conglomerate's expansion into cement, fertilizer, oil refining, and now port development reflects the kind of comprehensive economic planning that creates genuine value chains rather than perpetuating dependency. The timing of this port proposal is particularly significant, given Nigeria's recent economic policies that prioritize local production and import substitution. The Dangote refinery, which began operations in 2023, already demonstrates how African industrial capacity can reduce dependence on imported petroleum products. Now, with indigenous port capacity, the entire value chain, from raw material processing to finished product distribution, can be controlled by African institutions serving African interests. The proposed Dangote port in Ogun State represents far more than a commercial venture. It exemplifies the kind of strategic thinking that transforms regional economies and challenges global power structures. When we analyze this project through the lens of African sovereignty, several crucial dimensions emerge that reveal its revolutionary potential. First, consider the geographical positioning of this port within Nigeria's industrial landscape. The proposed location in the Olokola Free Trade Zone, approximately 100 kilometers from Dangote's existing fertilizer and petrochemical plants in Lagos, creates what economists call industrial clustering, the concentration of related industries in a specific geographic area to maximize efficiency and minimize costs. This isn't accidental. It's the kind of sophisticated economic planning that built industrial powerhouses like Germany's Ruhr Valley or America's Steel Belt. The fact that Dangote initially intended to locate his plants in the same free trade zone as the proposed port reveals even more strategic thinking. Had the previous Ogun State administration not created bureaucratic obstacles, Nigeria would already possess an integrated industrial maritime complex that could serve as a model for African economic development. The resilience Dangote demonstrated by relocating his plants to Lagos while maintaining plans for the port shows the kind of adaptive strategic thinking that characterizes successful African entrepreneurship. What makes this project particularly significant is its potential to disrupt established shipping patterns that have historically disadvantaged African producers. Currently, Nigerian manufacturers often depend on foreign-controlled ports and shipping lines that prioritize Western commercial interests over African needs. The Dangote port, designed to be Nigeria's largest and deepest, could accommodate larger vessels and offer more competitive services, potentially reshaping West African maritime commerce. The economic implications extend far beyond Nigeria's borders. A world-class port controlled by African capital could serve as a hub for intra-African trade, supporting the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, by providing efficient transit points for goods moving between African nations. This aligns with the Pan-African vision of economic integration that leaders like Julius Nyerere and Thomas Sankara advocated, using African resources to serve African development rather than external extraction. Furthermore, the port's connection to Dangote's industrial operations creates what economists call backward and forward linkages, economic relationships that stimulate growth in related industries. The fertilizer plants will benefit from improved export capacity, while the port's construction and operation will create thousands of jobs for African workers. This multiplier effect demonstrates how strategic African investment can generate broad-based economic benefits rather than concentrating wealth in foreign hands. The project also represents a sophisticated response to global supply chain vulnerabilities exposed during the COVID-19 pandemic. African nations that depended heavily on imported goods faced severe shortages when international shipping was disrupted. By developing integrated domestic production and distribution capacity, the Dangote model offers a pathway toward greater economic resilience and reduced dependence on volatile global markets. Critics might argue that private sector development cannot substitute for comprehensive state-led economic planning. However, in the context of contemporary African political economy, where many governments lack the resources or capacity for large-scale infrastructure development, strategic private investment like Dangote's can serve as a catalyst for broader economic transformation. The key difference lies in ensuring that such investment serves African interests, rather than merely extracting wealth for external benefit. The port project also demonstrates how African entrepreneurs can leverage their understanding of local conditions to create competitive advantages. Dangote's familiarity with Nigerian regulatory environments, his relationships with local suppliers, and his commitment to African market development give him strategic advantages that foreign competitors cannot easily replicate. This indigenous knowledge becomes a form of economic sovereignty that challenges the assumption that only Western companies can deliver world-class infrastructure. Moreover, the project's emphasis on depth and capacity addresses a crucial limitation of existing West African ports. Many current facilities cannot accommodate the largest container ships, forcing African exporters to use smaller vessels or transship through European ports, both options that increase costs and reduce competitiveness. A deep-water port controlled by African capital could position Nigeria as a regional maritime hub, attracting shipping traffic that currently bypasses West Africa entirely. The geopolitical ramifications of Dangote's port proposal extend far beyond commercial considerations, touching the very foundations of global economic power structures that have marginalized African interests for centuries. When we examine this project through the lens of international political economy, we discover implications that could reshape not only regional trade patterns, but also Africa's position in global maritime commerce. Consider first the challenge this port presents to established shipping oligopolies that have historically controlled African trade routes. The global shipping industry remains dominated by European and Asian companies that prioritize routes serving their home markets over African development needs. A major African-controlled port could disrupt these arrangements by offering competitive alternatives that prioritize African exporters and importers, potentially triggering a broader reconfiguration of maritime trade patterns. The timing of this project coincides with China's Belt and Road Initiative, which has invested heavily in African port infrastructure. However, the Dangote port represents a fundamentally different model. Indigenous African capital, creating infrastructure that serves African interests rather than foreign strategic objectives. This distinction becomes crucial when we consider debt sustainability and long-term economic sovereignty. African-owned infrastructure cannot be weaponized against African interests in the way that foreign-controlled assets might be during periods of international tension. The proposed port also aligns with Nigeria's broader geopolitical strategy of positioning itself as West Africa's economic anchor. Nigeria's economy already accounts for approximately 60% of West African GDP, and improved maritime infrastructure could strengthen this regional dominance while creating opportunities for smaller West African nations to benefit from increased trade volumes. This represents the kind of positive-sum regional integration that Pan-Africanists have long advocated. From a global perspective, the port could enhance Africa's bargaining position in international trade negotiations. Currently, African nations often negotiate from positions of infrastructural weakness, lacking the capacity to efficiently handle large-scale export operations. World-class African-controlled port infrastructure could change this dynamic by providing the logistical foundation for more assertive African participation in global value chains. The project also has implications for energy security and resource sovereignty. Nigeria's petroleum sector has historically been dominated by foreign corporations that control both production and distribution networks. The Dangote port, combined with the Dangote refinery, creates an integrated energy value chain that reduces dependence on foreign-controlled infrastructure. This model could inspire similar developments across Africa, gradually reducing the continent's vulnerability to external economic pressure. Furthermore, the port's potential role in facilitating intra-African trade cannot be overstated. The AFCFTA represents the world's largest free trade area by number of countries, but its success depends on efficient transportation infrastructure. African-controlled ports that prioritize intra-African trade could significantly reduce the costs and complexities that currently limit commerce between African nations. This economic integration has profound political implications, potentially strengthening African unity and reducing susceptibility to external manipulation. The project also challenges narratives about African technological and managerial capacity. Western media often portrays large-scale African infrastructure projects as necessarily dependent on foreign expertise and financing. The Dangote port, if successful, would demonstrate that African capital, guided by African strategic vision, can deliver world-class infrastructure that meets international standards while serving African interests. However, the project's success will depend partly on Nigeria's broader political stability and regulatory environment. This highlights the crucial relationship between economic sovereignty and good governance. Sustainable African development requires not only strategic private investment, but also competent public institutions that can support and regulate such investment effectively. The cultural significance of Dangote's port proposal resonates deeply within African consciousness, representing more than mere commercial infrastructure. It embodies the realization of ancestral dreams about African economic self-determination and the restoration of our continent's historical role as a center of global trade and innovation. Long before European colonization, African civilizations controlled sophisticated trade networks that connected diverse regions through maritime and overland routes. The Kingdom of Kush traded along the Red Sea, the Swahili city-states dominated East African maritime commerce, and West African empires like Ghana and Mali built wealth through strategic control of trade routes. The proposed Dangote port represents a return to this heritage of African commercial leadership, demonstrating that contemporary African entrepreneurs can reclaim our continent's rightful place in global commerce. This cultural dimension becomes particularly significant when we consider how colonial narratives systematically erased African commercial achievements while portraying European control as natural and inevitable. The success of African-owned infrastructure projects like the Dangote port challenges these colonial assumptions by demonstrating that African capital, guided by African vision, can create world-class facilities that serve African interests while competing successfully in global markets. The project also reflects evolving African business culture that increasingly prioritizes long-term strategic thinking over short-term profit maximization. Dangote's willingness to pursue integrated industrial development, combining manufacturing, refining, and now port operations, demonstrates the kind of patient capital formation that builds sustainable economic foundations rather than merely extracting quick returns. For Nigeria's younger generation, the port represents tangible evidence that African entrepreneurship can create the kind of opportunities that retain talent and capital on the continent. Too many young Africans have witnessed wealth extraction by foreign corporations, while local communities remained marginalized. African-controlled infrastructure that creates quality employment and business opportunities offers hope for a different future where African talent serves African development. The project's cultural impact extends beyond Nigeria to inspire similar initiatives across Africa. When African entrepreneurs succeed in creating world-class infrastructure, they demonstrate possibilities that can motivate similar efforts in other African nations. This creates what scholars call demonstration effects, successful models that inspire replication and adaptation in different contexts. As we reach the conclusion of our analysis, it becomes clear that the Dangote port proposal represents far more than a single infrastructure project. It embodies a fundamental shift toward African-controlled economic development that could transform our continent's relationship with global commerce. This initiative demonstrates what becomes possible when African capital, guided by African strategic vision, is deployed to create integrated industrial ecosystems that serve African interests while competing successfully in international markets. The project's significance lies not merely in its potential economic benefits, but in its demonstration of African agency and capability. For too long, narratives about African development have portrayed our continent as dependent on foreign expertise, financing, and leadership. The Dangote port challenges these assumptions by showing that African entrepreneurs can conceive, finance, and execute world-class infrastructure projects that meet international standards while prioritizing African needs. Looking ahead, the success of this port could inspire similar initiatives across Africa, creating a network of African-controlled infrastructure that supports genuine economic sovereignty. As other African entrepreneurs observe Dangote's integrated approach to industrial development, we may witness the emergence of similar comprehensive strategies that combine manufacturing, processing, and distribution under African control. The project also highlights the crucial relationship between private sector dynamism and broader African development. While state-led development remains important, strategic private investment like Dangote's can catalyze broader economic transformation by creating employment, developing local supply chains, and demonstrating successful business models that others can emulate or adapt. For our viewers who understand that African sovereignty requires more than political independence, it demands economic self-determination. This project represents the kind of strategic thinking that can transform our continent's future. As we continue to analyze and celebrate such initiatives, we contribute to a broader consciousness about African capability and potential that challenges limiting narratives while inspiring continued excellence. If you found this analysis valuable and want to support more content that celebrates African strategic thinking and sovereignty, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell to stay updated on our latest content. Your engagement helps us reach more viewers who share our commitment to African development and self-determination. Share this video with others who understand that Africa's future depends on African-controlled economic development, and join our growing community of viewers who recognize that supporting African sovereignty means celebrating the visionaries who are building the infrastructure for our continent's prosperous future. Together, we can amplify the voices and stories that demonstrate Africa's incredible potential when our people are free to pursue their strategic vision without external limitations or interference. The Dangote port represents one chapter in Africa's ongoing story of economic transformation. Subscribe to ensure you don't miss future chapters in this remarkable journey toward genuine African sovereignty and prosperity.